I was 9 when the eclipse began. On that day I huddled in my father's arms, staring at the sky in wide-eyed wonder. It was supposed to last only a few minutes. At least, that was what the scientists said. We stood outside in the courtyard, wearing flimsy cardboard glasses that filtered out the sun's intensity. The moon crept slowly in front of the blinding disk, transforming the day into a brief, dusky twilight. Most adults watched in awe, assured by the fact that nature had repeated this celestial spectacle countless times before. But terror seized me instead. Maybe it was how the birds suddenly stopped singing, or how my father's arms stiffened protectively around my shoulders. Something deep within me sensed that this was more than an ordinary event. It was going to change everything. In the following months, astronomers corroborated what had begun as a fringe theory. Earth was drifting off its usual orbit. There were murmurs about gravitational imbalances between the sun, Earth, and the moon. Climate patterns around the globe shifted unpredictably. Storms raged for weeks. Hurricanes battered coastlines that had never seen violent weather before. The phenomenon that had begun as a wonder quickly turned menacing. The winter arrived 3 months too soon, only for entire swaths of land to experience unrelenting heat waves a few weeks later. The confusion grew, and soon nations scrambled to address growing food shortages. At first, it was dismissed as a temporary disruption, but the drifting continued. Those with authority were slow to act, unsure whether to wage war against each other or search for a solution together. Some countries began rationing supplies in secret. Suddenly, a swirl of fear, mistrust, and desperation overcame the world. 2 years later, scientists fully admitted their miscalculation. Earth was not only drifting, but tilting in such a way that half would be locked under perpetual darkness, while the other half would scorch in unending daylight. Our planet was on track to transform into a celestial body reminiscent of tidally locked worlds orbiting distant stars. The dramatic shift accelerated with each passing month, until the penumbra grew ever larger above us. It was a sight that defied comprehension. A half-visible sun on the horizon, permanently grazing the edge of our sky. The transitional twilight that should have been fleeting took on a stubborn permanence in the band that bridged night and day. Some people fled to the bright side, hoping it would still offer some modicum of normalcy. Most, however, could not afford the exodus. They were stranded where they had been born. I was 13 when the night finally came down like a curtain and never lifted. Many called this new epoch the eternal eclipse. The final day in our region was tinged with dread. My father and I gathered as many supplies as we could carry. We had heard stories from travelers who escaped the border zones. There was talk of an impenetrable darkness creeping ever westward. Its slow approach consumed not merely the sun, but all signs of life that depended on light. We thought we could outrun it, that if we moved far enough east, light might remain. But soon it became clear that we were moving in vain. In under a week, the daylight vanished completely. I felt a queasy thrill and terror in equal measure when I saw the faint traces of the sun's outlines slip into permanent shadow. Streetlights flickered and gave out, as power grids collapsed under the pressure of continuous demand. Generators sputtered to life for brief periods, giving neighborhoods a feeble glow. Then, one by one, they succumbed to breakdowns and lack of fuel. People tried to keep the darkness at bay with makeshift lanterns, oil lamps, and candles, but these meager flames felt like an insult against a cosmos that had stopped answering our plea. Within a year, the region where I lived with my father was no better than a ravaged wasteland. The city council tried to maintain order, issuing rations of tinned food and water that had been stored in underground facilities, but the monthly shipments dwindled. The farmland around us no longer produced anything. It was too cold and dark. Animals died off by the thousands. Some people attempted to cultivate mushrooms and algae in subterranean greenhouses, but these new micro-farms were not enough to fend off starvation. Markets closed, roads cracked, and homes lay in disrepair as families moved closer together, forming clusters for mutual support or sometimes mutual despair. My father improvised a greenhouse in the old dairy barn behind our dilapidated house. He lined it with reflective foils and used all the spare battery packs he could find to power a string of neon tubes. For a while, It gave us a modest yield of fungal crops. There were days when I felt an odd sense of accomplishment, holding a handful of pale mushrooms that grew in this artificially lit cave. But it was never enough to ward off the knowledge that darkness had swallowed everything else. In that stifling gloom, people began to whisper about raiders from the borderline Twathos who scavenged under the perpetual twilight that separated day from night. This ring of uncertain half-light became the battleground for the desperate. Rumors carried horrors of bandit camps, mercenaries hired by wealthy landowners on the bright side, and roving gangs that preyed on the weak. My father and I tried to stay hidden, living as inconspicuously as possible. We turned off all illumination once we heard strangers nearby. More than once, we crouched behind boarded windows as armed silhouettes rifled through the streets, taking anything of value. A few times they tried to burglarize our barn, but since it was well camouflaged, they either missed it or decided it wasn't worth the effort. Still, the fear of discovery loomed over me. I could barely sleep at night. Then again, calling it night in a place that knew no day felt paradoxical. Some tried to leave for the bright side, but the journey was fraught with unimaginable peril. One had to cross the dangerous twilight belt, which spanned scorching heat by day and frigid cold by night. The abrupt temperature swings alone could kill. Then there were the Watchers, shadowy figures rumored to patrol the region, capturing anyone who might bring news of the dark side's plight to the day side. I never knew if they were government agents or vigilantes, but the stories of missing travelers piled up. Each spring, when the usual seasonal shift should have brought a sliver of sunrise, we would step outside, breath pluming in the cold, and see only the same gloom. It was as though the sky had forgotten us. By the time I turned 19, my father had grown frail. He coughed frequently, especially when the batteries powering our lamps faltered, leaving the greenhouse too cold for his lungs. Supplies became scarce beyond measure. I scavenged the husks of abandoned stores only to find broken glass and useless scraps. If someone discovered a can of beans or a bag of rice, it sparked whispered arguments or outright violence. Fear replaced neighborly bonds. The hearty greetings from years ago vanished. Everyone had retreated into survival mode. Desperation often torched any sense of decency. We had a few neighbors who banded together, pooling resources to keep a communal generator running, but we were forever on the brink of losing what little we had. It got to the point where I would weigh my father's life against the risk of raiders every time I left the house. I still vividly recall sneaking into an abandoned clinic for antibiotics, the terror drying my mouth as I crept through the corridors, listening for footsteps other than my own. I found a single bottle of expired pills, which kept him going a bit longer. One morning, though it was impossible to tell if it was truly morning, I noticed something unusual outside. A flicker of movement in the swirling black sky. My first thought was that it might be survivor planes or drones from the bright side, but it turned out to be celestial debris. A small meteor shower, illuminated in a faint haze by the overshadowed sun. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was witnessing how fragile this new cosmic balance was. The horizon seemed more askew than usual, as if the entire sky had tilted further. Days later, the rumors started again. The planet's drift was accelerating. There was talk that even the day side was facing new catastrophes, scorching temperatures, unstoppable wildfires, and unstoppable meltdown of what little ice sheets remained. The half of Earth bathed in darkness was not the only place in existential peril. The entire planet was at stake. Despite the danger, I decided it was time to attempt the crossing into the twilight belt. My father had fallen ill beyond anything I could hope to cure with expired medication. A traveling physician might be found on the other side, or so people said. Every day we waited, he grew weaker. Radiation from solar flares spiking around the planet, combined with nearly constant exposure to cold, had taken its toll. We argued about it. He insisted I should leave him behind, that traveling with him would slow me down. But I refused. We spent a week planning the route, gathering meager supplies. We rigged a wheelchair from salvaged bike parts, reinforcing it with thick rubber wheels that might handle rough terrain. A neighbor gave me a small container of lamp oil in exchange for some precious antibiotic pills. The best trade I had ever made, in my view, because the lamp would be our only reliable way to see once the batteries died. We set off. The small roads were fractured and strewn with debris from car wrecks, fallen trees, and long-forgotten attempts at barricades. It was slow, agonizing progress. The eternal gloom pressed around us on every side. Sometimes I could make out starlight overhead, a pinprick reminder of what the cosmos offered beyond our broken world. My father tried to remain upbeat, but each jolt of the wheelchair over cracked pavement had him wincing with pain. After 2 days of travel, we encountered our first major obstacle, a collapsed overpass that forced us to reroute. It led us down a narrow valley that was infamous for bandits. Sure enough, one evening, while we were hunched against the remains of a moss-covered wall, 2 figures emerged from the darkness. Their approach was announced by a faint crunch of gravel underfoot. My heart hammered as I gripped my makeshift spear, a metal rod fashioned from a broken street sign. In a low voice, they demanded food, water, anything we might have. They brandished knives, and one had a rifle strapped across his back. I knew there was no chance of overpowering them without risking my father's life. I offered them the last of our tinned goods and a few precious antibiotic pills. They eyed me with an unsettling glint, probably deciding if it was worth taking us prisoner. After a tense moment, the older of the 2 pointed at our lamp, demanding we hand that over too. My father let out a strangled cough. We both knew surrendering the lamp meant we'd stumble in the pitch black for the remainder of our journey, turning it into a suicide march. I tried to plead, but the rider advanced. I made a desperate move, pressing the tin of pills into his hand and swearing that more medication lay hidden in the city ruins behind us. It was a bluff. Luckily, his greed sparked. With a hiss, he motioned for his companion to move out, presumably to investigate. They stalked off, leaving us trembling and hungry, but at least still alive and in possession of our precious lamp. We continued the next day, managing to slip through that ravine without further encounters. Every so often I stumbled across dark patches in the road, suspicious lumps that looked like abandoned clothing or gear, and some turned out to be corpses. Whenever I spotted them, I turned my father's wheelchair toward another path. A few times, we saw the glint of reflective eyes in the darkness. Feral dogs, perhaps, or mutated creatures adapted to the endless night. They never attacked, though. My guess was they, too, had learned to keep their distance. The environment in the dark half had grown eerily still. The hush of wind through dead trees was the only soundtrack. On the 5th day, we at last reached the twilight zone. A band of perpetual dusk hung on the horizon, glowing with a faint purplish hue. It was mesmerizing to gaze upon after so many years of unbroken darkness. Across the expanse, I caught sight of black silhouettes that rose from the ground like jagged teeth, rocky formations, or perhaps the remnants of tall buildings from a city that had once inhabited the region. The path ahead was riddled with cracks, spewing sulfuric steam. Some said tectonic shifts had occurred as well, releasing toxic gases in this region. Every instinct told me to turn back, but backing out meant condemning my father. So we pressed onward, cautious of every step. I had heard of a hidden settlement in the Twilight Zone, sometimes called the Gloaming Camp. Legends circulated among survivors on both sides of the planet. Supposedly, it was a haven for those willing to brave the extremes of half-light and half-dark, a place where some semblance of normalcy could be found. Geothermal vents, it was said, heated enclosed greenhouses, enabling the growth of hardy vegetables. Clinics run by doctors who'd forsaken the old medical systems supposedly offered care to desperate souls. Whether the stories were true or mere folklore, we aimed for it because we had no alternative. We encountered more frequent signs of life the deeper we traveled into the twilight band. Human footprints mingled with wheel tracks. Occasional piles of junk indicated that others had attempted to build temporary shelters. Yet, the temperature changes were brutal. One moment it felt slightly warmer, and then a bitter cold would settle in as soon as we hit a shaded spot. My father's breathing grew more labored, his skin was clammy, and he coughed until flecks of blood stained his handkerchief. The futility of our journey weighed heavily on me. Even if the camp existed, would we make it in time? Desperate for a moment's rest, We found partial shelter in the ruins of a bus station. Bent metal pillars rose amid broken glass. I attempted to light a small fire from the scraps of furniture and paper we found. My father shivered so violently that I took off my jacket and draped it around him. As the flames flickered, licking at the darkness, I realized I hadn't slept properly in days. Every muscle in my body ached. My eyes sank closed for a moment. Then I jerked awake to the sound of footsteps. Was it bandits again? A figure ambled into the station, hands lifted in a gesture of peace. Soft light from the flames revealed a woman with short, curly hair and a patch over one eye. She wore tattered, layered clothing suitable for traveling. Quietly, she asked if we needed help. I glanced at my father, who was too weak to respond. She stayed at a distance, as if respecting our space, then explained that she was part of a nearby outpost. She had supplies, but wouldn't hand them over unless we came with her. Distrust flared in me, but I felt a flicker of hope as well. After brief hesitation, I agreed. Without her help, my father wouldn't last another day. She led us across a desolate field of cracked earth warmed by slight geothermal vents. When we topped a low rise, I saw a scattering of lights in the distance, small lamps, like the stars had descended to the ground. The woman whistled, and a guard near a makeshift gate recognized her call. With cautious looks over their shoulders, they let us pass. Inside, a modest collection of huts and tents circled around a central greenhouse dome built from salvaged glass and plastic sheeting. Beneath that dome, I saw plants. Real, vibrant plants that glowed with the sheen of life. People shuffled quietly between structures, silhouettes in the half-light, carrying out chores or simply gathering around burn barrels for warmth. A volunteer nurse approached from the largest tent and gently helped lift my father onto a cot. The nurse examined him under a single LED lantern powered by a rumbling generator. They gave him fluids, medication, and an oxygen mask. I watched in astonishment. Resources here, though scarce, were apparently enough to sustain a small community. While the nurse attended him, the woman who had guided us introduced herself as Mara. She was a scout and scavenger for the outpost, bringing in travelers whom she deemed trustworthy. When I asked her why she had bothered to help us, she shrugged. "We're building a future," she said, "no matter how hopeless it looks." Her eye flicked toward the distant horizon, where the sky split into fading shadows. It's better to try than just to survive. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of progress. The greenhouse was truly impressive. Heated by vents in the ground, they cultivated hardy root vegetables, some grains, and even a few fruit-bearing plants. Powered by a patchwork array of solar cells gleaning minimal energy from the half-hidden sun, the outpost managed to keep its vital systems running. One of the camp elders explained that they also engaged in limited trade with a dayside settlement. Occasionally, brave couriers would attempt the crossing, hauling produce that thrived in partial light to exchange for items like spare parts or medication. Many couriers never returned, waylaid by dangers or lured by the dayside's illusions. But enough came back to keep the outposts alive. My father's condition was still precarious, but the environment here gave him a chance. Over the following weeks he regained some strength. Meanwhile, I contributed by helping Mara gather resources from abandoned structures. Whenever we set out, she warned me to stay vigilant of watchers who prowled the twilight zone. True enough, we often spotted them at a distance, military-like figures, scanning the area. Mara guessed they worked for dayside elites who wanted to ensure no mass exodus arrived at their gates. So we skirted their patrols, slipping through side roads and ravines. I quickly learned the route through the zone was like a labyrinth. One had to move under the partial glow, using improvised camouflage to blend with the dusty, grayish terrain. Despite these precautions, we occasionally had tense moments when watchers came too close. One night, while returning with a batch of salvaged medical supplies, we spotted a fire in the distance. Through binoculars, Mara identified a battered caravan being attacked by watchers. Flames consumed the travelers' wagons, and silhouettes struggled before falling to the ground. She started to edge forward, her jaw set in a grim line. But I held her back. We had no numbers to fight them off, no hope of rescuing those unfortunate souls. It was a heart-wrenching lesson in the cruelty that had become commonplace. Back in the outpost, somber news awaited. One of the greenhouse's main geothermal conduits had collapsed, taking with it a crucial heat source. It meant the plants would be at risk of freezing. The camp elders called for volunteers to help fix it. Everyone pitched in, digging out the collapsed vent shaft and reinforcing supports with scrap metal. We labored by the flickering light of our few lanterns. My father tried to help, but he was still too weak. He offered advice on rebuilding structures. He had once been a carpenter in a world that barely remembered trades anymore. Mara and I worked side by side, sweat mingling with the dust on our faces. Hours stretched into days as we fought to save that precious greenhouse. Eventually, we managed to reroute the heat flow. When we saw steam rising again, we erupted in relieved cheers. In that moment, I felt a sense of unity, a fragile bond that was stronger than the bleakness around us. Over time, I learned more about the outpost dream. Their leaders believed someday, if enough refugees from both sides came together, we could push back the Watchers and create a corridor that allowed for safer travel between day and night. They spoke of technology that might correct Earth's orbit, though many scientists had claimed that idea was futile. Yet, the dream persisted. Some in the camp argued it would be better to migrate entirely to the day side, while others insisted the day side had become uninhabitable due to the relentless sun and political turmoil. It was left to each newcomer to decide which hope to cling to. My father's health continued improving under the outpost's care. He joked that he was ready to repay their kindness by building a mushroom palace, referencing our old greenhouse days. In truth, every person's contribution mattered here, no matter how small. I worked with other young scouts to explore a plan for establishing a more direct supply route. We scouted out vantage points where we might build watchtowers to detect the Watchers before they got too close. The nights, well, every time was night to us, were still dangerous, but at least we had begun forging a community that didn't merely survive on desperation and fear. In the end, the darkest half of the planet remained what it was, a perpetual eclipse, an unbroken night that had once signaled doom for every living thing. Yet in this twilight outpost we found a seed of possibility. We nurtured faint sprouts in the greenhouse, but also in our hearts. The world still felt terribly fragile, teetering on the edge of further cataclysms or conflicts, but at least here, huddled under a partial glow, we were not dying alone in the cold or scorching in the agonizing heat of endless day. Instead, we had carved out a space for hope, for rebuilding. I still remember how, months after our arrival, my father and I stood outside the greenhouse. I had my arm around his shoulders to steady him. He gazed at the horizon, where purple dusk met star-flecked darkness. His breath rasped, but there was a spark in his eyes. "It's not the sun," he said quietly, "but it's something." I nodded, gently pressing my cheek against his. We both knew we might never see a real sunrise again, not in the way we used to, but we had found our own pocket of warmth and light, a fragile sanctuary in the shadowed remains of Earth. It was enough. For now, that sliver of twilight where day and night bled into each other was our home. Our promise that even in the deepest dark, life could persist.